Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
This week's topic is Marx and money. How did Marx think about money, and is there room in his thinking for something like basic income? Joining us to discuss is economist Karen Helveg Petersen. Dr. Petersen works at the intersection of politics and economics, and she is someone who's actually read Marx's work and tried to make sense of it at a deeper level. She published a book in 2017 entitled Rent Capitalism, Economic Theory and Global Reality, with the aim of updating Marx's theory to capture today's world. In preparation for today's discussion, we read a paper by Petersen entitled The Money View and Marx's Theory of Money and Credit. Marx is often associated with the commodity view of money, gold, etc., but that's not really what we're going to be talking about today. In the paper, Petersen explores Marx's Capital Volume 3, Part 5, in which he talks more about the mechanics of the banking and credit system. So she compares Marx's view with the views of Walter Bagehot, who was a famous banker and editor of The Economist in the late 19th century, as well as Perry Mehrling, who has a more modern take on the economics of money and banking. He created the Money and Banking MOOC on Coursera, which we're all big fans of here. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Karen, maybe give us an introduction of Marx's perspective on money and credit.
Well, first of all, money, of course, was very central to Marx's whole work. I mean, the object of the production and the economic life was for him profit in money terms, not just to make people live and survive, but in order for some people to become richer while other people had to toil. So that's a basic tenet of capitalism. Money, of course, predates capitalism, but Marx then goes on to say that in capitalism, it becomes involved in the capitalist process. So it's part of the class structure, you can say, it's part of the outcome of production, and it takes its shape and evolves together with the capitalist production process. So therefore, of course, he could not just stick with the notion that money was gold, which it maybe was at a certain point in time, gold coins, silver coins, etc., but also the way it evolved within a monetary system. And he saw that the monetary system developed particularly in England with the creation of the Bank of England, where commercial banks and the whole credit system that was evolving around it, or before antedating even commercial banks, that they were gathered in around this central bank because of a certain necessity. And the point that really puts together the strains of Bagehot, Marx, and Mehrling is that the Banking Act of 1844 came to determine how the system developed. It was a miserable system in many ways, but it did shape the form that money could take and how it could develop with trade and finance. Sometimes the system restricted the markets, sometimes it helped the markets, and the system itself had to adapt in order to help the capitalist market. That's how I see it anyway, and I think that Mehrling agrees with me in that. So that's what Marx was tracing until his own time, which was, let's say, 1870, a little bit more than that. But of course, he died in 1883 and didn't write for the last years of his life. So we don't have his updates to our times. So we have to ourselves find ways to see how new forms of money, a way of dealing with markets and money, how they have developed, and how to understand that in conceptual terms in order not to be inundated just by a lot of facts and numbers that stare at you every day in the newspapers or whatever source you consult. So this is also what I'm after, to put order in developments, to see whether they are important, fundamental, whether they're just accidental, and whether they really represent something new that is important, or just a little offshoot. And the good point is that Marx had this part 5, or rather it was his collaborator Engels that developed part 5 of Capital Volume 3, because he had only left some notes and Engels had to make sense of them. It is not a very readable part. It is sort of filled with quotes that are difficult to even see where they're coming from. And it's a work to read it. Also, there are many seeming contradictions, but having read a lot of Marx, so I try to make sense, and also developed his main concepts from part 5. And then I look at Merling, Batchet, and then afterwards Merling. And then on the basis of that, I go on and say what happened with the Bank of England, what happened when the US took over the power of the world, and so on and so forth. So it's really the macro level I'm very interested in at the deep level. And incidentally, I find that gold really has haunted the system nearly up to this date, or even perhaps to this date. So this was just an introduction. Marx has a lot of writing about the basics of money and how it could have developed, and the logic between the commodity and money as a commodity, and the functions of money as means of exchange, as means of payment, store of value, unit of account, measure of value, and so on and so forth in the first volume of Capital. But if I went into that in this paper, then it would be endlessly long and never really get to the point I'm after, which is this credit version of Marx, which most Marxist economists have not looked at very much, if at all.
Right.
Okay.
So before we get into comparing kind of Marx with Merling and Bagehot, I mean, of those definitions and descriptions of money that you mentioned, means of exchange and medium of payment and all those sorts of things, like what is the one that Marx kind of comes back to the most frequently, if money isn't a commodity or if it isn't any one of those things? What's his basic working understanding of money in this section that you've examined?
The basic understanding is that money can develop, and that money and its form, that it has many forms and many material shapes. Money is a concept. It's a concept which has to do with a reality that he does connect to production and his labor theory of value. Let me say that. Today it's very difficult to reconstruct that connection. I'm trying myself, but I won't go much into it here. But he shows that in actual exchange, you don't need the commodity to go and buy a piece of bread. You can just use a symbol of money or token, and so on and so forth. So more and more, as money was needed, its form, its material form became more and more immaterial. Banks developed, first banks, you can say, modern quote-unquote banks, developed in the 14th century, we may say, at the same time that trade credit developed. And that, of course, had to do with heaping money together and making it possible to lend money to others, and then to get a return for that. But in order for that return to be more than just you getting, you cutting the hair of somebody else, the capitalist process developed in a production of a more, so that when you produce by putting capital apparatus, by putting labor power, and so on and so forth, when you have those together, you will get more out of it than you put into it. And therefore, you will also, in a way, generate more money than you had at the beginning. And that money itself will also try to be more. So as we produce more, the money will also try to be more. So that these sort of circuits that intersect and also sometimes work against each other. So in a way, the money as a little instrument, just intermediating, should be available. But on the other hand, there are also situations where things have gone out of whack and where that will show up as a monetary phenomenon. Famously in crisis, we see that it's always money that is needed, when before the crisis you say there's a lot of money all over the place, there's a money overhang, all of a sudden the money that in one situation, or the instrument you could use in one situation to clear debt is not usable in another situation. So therefore, there are a lot of contradictions in the system, and it's sort of showing up all the contradictions of the capitalist society. But whenever there is a major crisis, new forms come up, and new ways of dealing with it comes up. And that's also what, for example, Perry Mehrling is showing, that even after the Second World War, there have been a lot of different sort of money markets developed and instruments.
So it sounds like Marx really does have kind of a credit theory of money, at least in this part.
Yeah.
So basically the money expands, or if it's working properly, it expands as necessary to facilitate real trade and production, stuff like that. And that sounds very similar to Mehrling talking about the expansion and contraction of credit. So I guess my question to you is, are there any important Marxian insights that Mehrling is missing or would benefit from in his explanation of how the money and banking system works?
Yes, well, I would say what I know of his writing, my impression of his thinking and the school of thought he comes from is that he's a post-Keynesian. So his macroeconomics is basically Keynesian. And that's very different from Marx anyway. So just there you have a big difference. I will not reproach him that, but what I think is that he doesn't make clear the connection between these huge money markets that he shows the operation of and how they develop, and for example, real investment. I mean, the ordinary thinking in economics, I mean, the basic thinking is that, okay, you have savings here and then you invest. And that's a very questionable concept. But on the other hand, there is investment financed through money markets, but it doesn't really deal with in which way that form is competing with other forms. What is the relationship between share capital and real capital, and what comes out of that investment, and how does that affect the other markets? It doesn't talk about wages. It doesn't talk about, I mean, productive developments, and so on and so forth. And given that he talks about so much else, I mean, I will not reproach him that, but I think that it is something that there is a need for a theory to connect this up. That's what I'm saying, because otherwise you end with a sort of a window here of finance and money and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, something is going on in the real world that, well, maybe it's creating problems, but we don't really deal with it. And I want to see the connection.
So it sounds like what's really missing from Mehrling is the connection between the functioning of money and banking and then the real economy. And that's something that Marx, of course, focuses on very much, is the real economy, and he fits his theory of credit into that. So that does feel important to me. You mentioned before profit in money terms when you were talking about Marx thinking about money, and that some people are getting richer while other people toil. So my understanding, and I'm not a Marx expert, but my understanding of Marx is that he views labor, people perform work, and then the benefit of that work, or the product of that work that they get back, that they get to keep for themselves, is what he calls necessary labor. And then the product of that work that goes to the employer or the lord or whatever, that is the surplus labor. So then the profit has to do with surplus labor. So how does money connect up with that? Is it that the money represents the real product of the labor, so it's kind of a token that represents that?
Well, yeah, no, what is really, what I think one has to understand is that the value is in a certain amount of that the value is produced, and there's a money value of that, which has to do with, that's where, of course, you have to have something compatible, namely that the money in some ways can measure what the value of the products are. And that's where, of course, you have the commodity theory of money. But when it comes to, and even to this day, we have production of gold. So gold has a certain value. You could say maybe the prices that we have to do with that, but the actual transmission mechanisms of this whole thing doesn't have to do with this commodity. So therefore, so that link may be also very weak today. Our prices and how relative prices are fixed have some conventional elements, some historical elements, and so we didn't start with the world today. So there may be something inherent, but there's a logic between the prices of different commodities, which has to do with the different production times put into them, and that will have to have a common denominator somehow. And that is money, and then ultimately that money itself has to have some relationship with value. But apart from that, the whole system is built up in many different ways that somehow contradict this basic phenomenon. That's also why many people think that money, the value of money, is guaranteed by the state, and so on and so forth. And I would say that somehow it is the legitimacy of money that is backed up by the ultimate legitimacy of the state or the credit of the state, but not the particular values that turn around in society. So you have to look at these different elements. But I think what is very important is that we have the private sector, to put it in those terms, that produce. And then we have more and more a public sector, and more where you have the government that plays a big role in society, and the money system that is a mixture of the two. The credit that is being generated, so to speak, independently of the public system, and then also the public system that then intertwines with both the capital circuit and the credit system, in order to sort of make sure that those circuits can work. So that's why we have the central bank, the relationship between the government, the state, the central bank, the commercial banks, and also people's ordinary salaries and revenues and so on and so forth. All of this is intermediated through some form of money that can take many shapes and forms. Today, of course, we know it's credit cards, accounts, and so on and so forth.
Right. And you can't really understand any one part of the system without also understanding how it's connected to everything else.
No, and you notice that, for example, some other people think that it's just the government can just issue money, and then somehow send it out into circulation, and then everything is fine, without thinking of this banking system that is just as essential, because that also gives value to money. If nothing was produced, I mean, the value would be worthless. This is what we see in hyperinflation, these episodes of hyperinflation. So we have to consider all elements.
Okay. And in the paper, you talk about capital in its money form. And my understanding, or my impression of that is that the idea is that certain forms of debt that pay interest almost represent capital. Can you get into how Marx defines capital, and then what it means to say that certain forms of maybe interest-bearing money or debt are capital in money form?
Yeah, it is capital money form. I mean, at first, Marx comes with many different specifications, one developed after the other, because this is how the world develops. But he sort of says that capital, well, first you put money into the process, you buy means of production, labor power, they work, and somehow what comes out of that, because so much more labor goes into it than is really paid, that is the new value coming out of it. That must be sold in the market. And when that is sold and realized in money form, which will of course be more money than before, so you can say that creates money in a certain sense. What he says is also money comes out of the accumulation process, because out of this, when you accumulate, produce more and more, you also produce something that is more money, more wealth in a sense. And but when we look at it very concretely, when this is sold on the market through credit or whatever, there will be more money to this capitalist, which he can reinvest, expand his production, or he can also lend it out. And that's what he calls money capital. That money that is being lent out at interest, but where the interest rate, and that's very important, will have to be lower than the rate of profit, because the rate of profit is what's governing the whole thing. So the profit rate is higher than the rate of interest in the basic shape. But he also says one more thing that I think is interesting. Many economists think that there is a natural rate of interest. Some think it's the same thing as the profit rate. Marx doesn't think so. He thinks that in a way, the money market as it has developed is a market where there's more or less demand for money, and there's more or less, and the interest rate will adapt to that market. So in that sense, in that little particular sense, he agrees with economists in a way, saying that, and he doesn't link it to the fact that that it will be somehow linked to production. Yeah, so there's no natural rate of interest.
There's no natural rate of interest. So I think it makes sense, of course, that there's lots of different interest rates in the market, depending on who's doing the borrowing, how long they're borrowing for, that kind of thing. And I think when economists, the Knut Wicksell perspective of there being a natural rate of interest, that has to do with, I think, kind of the bank rate, like what bank rate is compatible with a stable economy or a stable price level or something like that. But Bethany is asking in the chat, she's asking if what you said was that the government doesn't ensure the price level. You kind of separated the idea of ensuring the, I'm not sure, I don't remember what word you used, but the acceptability or integrity of the money versus kind of ensuring the price. So are you saying that the price, it's not important that the government keep the purchasing power of money stable, that it's more about kind of certifying that this is the official money, that kind of thing?
Well, I don't think, I mean, that's a complicated question.
Or maybe you don't think it can keep the price level stable. Yeah.
No. Well, let me say something else.
Yeah.
The price level as such, or prices are determined in some relationship with the amount of labor that it takes to produce it. That's sort of what Marx calls value. When we have productivity increases, then the value of the single product goes down, and thereby, in a way, the price should go down. So I would put it this way, that even if price level is constant, then economists, mainstream economists, reason that there's no inflation. I would say that can well be inflation in this situation, because prices should be much lower. So it's not the government that does it, but on the other hand, through certain means and manipulations and central bank movements, and also the government's fiscal policy, what it does in the market, it may influence certain prices, make things cheaper, and it should actually, because it funds cheaply, so it should make things overall more cheap. So in that sense, government can help in gearing what prices should be, and but they do not determine the price level, no.
So maybe you're talking about you can have inflation even when the price level is
stable.
Is steady, is staying the same.
Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. So is what you're saying is how you're defining inflation as prices are increasing relative to where they should be. And the reason why you can say that there's inflation when prices are stable is because where they should be is decreasing over time, basically?
Yeah, they should be decreasing, yes. If you get a lot of cheap goods from China that you normally produce much more expensively here, prices should be lower. If they're not lower, well, we assume the same things produced, of course. If they're not lower, then it's because of some other factors which we could call monetary factors that make them more expensive. Or it could be, I mean, that there's a lot of profit put on top of it or whatever. But basically, you could say that inflation by that token was not zero, even though it looks like that. And I think that is a subject that really should be studied if one can find any measure of it, because this is just what I'm reasoning. But it would be good to have some more people going into it. I worked with the concept of GDP, how to measure GDP, and there you have the situation that those who measure it, they say, okay, if prices change, the price level change, we neutralize that to see what the real product is. So they assume that implicitly that prices should be one over time.
It's interesting because I think you're defining inflation in a way that I think a lot of people think about inflation in sense they think the price should be a certain thing, and then inflation is when the price is getting above that. We want prices to be lower. Of course, when economists use the word inflation, they're usually talking specifically about a rise in the general price level. So inflation is any time that there is a rise in the general price level, and then if the general price level, the average price of goods is stable, then you have stable prices. And that's a more limited definition. It doesn't necessarily mean you're happy with what all the prices are, but I find that I think can bring some clarity to it. And I think a lot of people have different ideas about what prices should be for different markets. But in a way, if we all had our way, we would always pay a lower price for everything, right? People in general, market actors kind of want prices to be lower when they're paying them. And people selling kind of want prices to be higher. And so when I think about inflation, I think when you think about it as a baseline as just being stable, the general price level being stable, we can then think about, okay, well, what is the price system working efficiently in getting people more stuff, right? Like if the price level is stable, that means that when you get more money, when your income increases, you can get more stuff. Right. So that's a very different kind of the getting more stuff versus the price being lower.
Yeah, but that's obvious that this is the case. But I agree with you that there are two schools. I mean, in a way, what I'm quoting is Milton Friedman, who says that inflation is always monetary. And I say, that's by definition. But I know that there are others who say that's also because somehow costs are rising and so on and so forth. But why should that be inflation if costs rise? Costs rise. That's nothing to do with this particular phenomenon. So I would locate it in the monetary system, and that's also when you think about hyperinflation, that's very closely linked to the monetary system itself. So but anyway, it is to be debated. But I think it's very important when you discuss inflation that you first define it. What do you mean by it? Is it just a rise of prices at a general level? Because of course nobody defines inflation in terms of some prices rising, others falling. That's relatively prices changing, but it's a general rise in price level. So it's a general phenomenon. And why would that come about? And that's where most all agree that that's because of of something in the monetary system. But it's obvious that inflation does not in our days rise just because there's more money. That's obvious. We have seen that. So that we have to put aside. So it's just some other monetary phenomena that have to be dealt with. And I would say sort of baseless money that's just issued without any productive relation behind it. I agree, this is difficult to come by in actual practice, but I'm launching concepts here.
Yeah, so I think Derek and I would certainly agree that inflation isn't just kind of about the amount of money that's in the economy, at least not in the overly simplified Milton Friedman sense. Certainly it's related to how much money people are spending and how much stuff they're buying and that relationship there. You mentioned, you could have, if imports from China are getting easier and easier to get, then you would expect prices to go down. And the fact that they're not going down is analogous to a kind of inflation. There is a sense in which if all prices went down across the entire economy, then that's equivalent to no prices going down at all, right? Because it's just one price level, another price level. But if you want imports from China to become cheaper, the question is relative to what? So maybe relative to people's incomes. So maybe you're imagining that people's incomes stay the same. So that's a price that's not going down, but then the price of imports is going down or something like that. Is that kind of what you're imagining? So people can buy more because it's cheaper?
No, what I'm imagining is simply that the price translated to dollar terms of something produced in China is less than the same thing produced in Denmark. That's
okay.
It's as simple as that. It's a very simple notion. And we have seen many price falls because of, I'm using China as the equivalent of everything, of course, but we have seen these price falls in ordinary commodities, clothing, etc., because production costs are cheaper. But then we also know that there's a lot of intermediary profits put on top of them, so that what the cost would be in China is a lot different from what the cost is here. And part of that is intermediation, transport, but only a small part of it. And there's of course a lot of competition between these, by these profits and how much can be put on top of these goods in order for them still to be attractive in our markets. Another thing is that you can see that there are movements in these production costs. It is becoming more expensive to produce in China. So production is sort of a little bit slowly returning in some areas. Of course, also political overtones to that. But this is also happening. And so in a way, these extra profits put on top can also make it so that it will be more interesting to produce here. But anyway, the point was just that with productivity increasing, also in our own societies, prices should go down. We can see they've gone down for cars, computers, and so on and so forth, that can be produced so much more easily. So that's just the basic notion I was trying to introduce.
Okay, yeah, I think all of that makes sense to me. So I want to get to a quote from your paper. Here we go. And this is talking about, so the money view is Perry Mehrling's perspective. So the money view sees finance as a totally integrated part of the real economy, as all financial, commercial, and production-related transactions are beset by money flows. But the perspective that disappears in Mehrling is the destructive role of the basic profit drive in the whole of capitalism's emanations and hectic market moves, including how it drives money markets. Behind this lies the Marxian problem: how the realization of profit produced interrelates with the money market. Profits create new money, don't they? If part of this money is not used to expand production, it will be lent out solely for portfolio investments. When central banks add to this money splurging, the situation worsens. Mehrling also says surprisingly little about the market for shares over and above that, how the markets interact with investments fundamentally. Mehrling is on the lookout for a sustainable new international monetary system, although he refutes all notions of equilibrium and permanent stability. So there's a lot in here to ask about. Yeah, the first thing I want to ask about is the perspective of the destructiveness of profit and the basic profit drive that Marx talks about, the realization of profit produced. So can you maybe give an overview of Marx's perspective on profit and how it's destructive?
Yeah, because, well, capital always, and this is something which is a common notion, even, I mean, today, all know that. Well, if a company doesn't show better profits than last year, maybe it is in trouble. Okay, nobody wants to invest in it. And so there's always this drive to get bigger, to get more profits, and it is very often measured through the profit rate. And if the profit rate goes down, then why produce yourself if you can invest that same money that you may have gotten out of of your production and your sales? Why not invest it in alternative forms that seem to be giving better results? It could be investment overseas, it could be whatever. So, but all of these things like investment overseas can become, well, destructive for societies and even for capitalism itself. If we look at this outsourcing that we have seen in the last 30 years, that has been destructive for societies and to some extent for, I'm talking the US American capital at home. So this will drive also invention, new products that may have a smaller margin and so on and so forth. So there's always a run for higher and higher margins, or if not higher margins, then that you get small margins more rapidly. So you get a short-term turnover. And that's what I think how I read a little bit these money markets. I mean, these money markets, when I think about them, I read about them through Merlin, they're insane. I mean, you have overnight loans or you have split second loans and I don't know what. And obviously it's only the hugest players who can be there. It's not you and I mean, with a little 5 cents. So they also drive the margins lower by that token, but because they're so big, they can still survive. But they're more desperate in survival, I would say, than ever before. So I mean, you can also see ordinary industries are jealous of Apple or Facebook and so on and so forth. What does Facebook produce? Well, yeah, a lot of small margins of income. And they really don't produce anything very tangible. But we know that they get something out of it because they attach their business model. This is deep down, it's businesses that pay Facebook for data or whatever it is. So in a way, it's just an ordinary old-fashioned model for advertisement, but hugely sophisticated. And the same in the financial markets. So I cannot see how this can go on forever, I must say. So that's why I see that it's the same profit drive that drives it, but drives it over the brink. So far, we see that every time the brink is near or we're getting close to getting over it, or maybe collapse, then some rescue is coming and it finds new ways. And capitalism and people in capitalism are very inventive, brilliant, and so on and so forth, and find ideas. But somehow you can't help thinking it can't go on forever.
Yeah,
So
well, I mean,
that was one answer.
Well, something that the three of us have in common that I wanted to highlight is that I think we all have the intuition that the monetary economy, it ought to reflect the productive economy. And I think we would probably all say that when we look at a lot of those really complex money markets, we see a lot of money that's doing stuff that's not connected to the real parts, the parts that we really want to make sure grow and survive. And so, but I guess maybe the difference is that we might say that, okay, what we want to do then is make sure that people's drive to collect money, the profit drive, is better aligned with the parts of the real economy and not so much with the purely financial economy. So I guess I'm still not quite understanding why you would say that the drive to get money, the drive to have your revenues exceed your costs, the motivation to collect profit, which you've said, clearly plays a role in driving investment and that sort of thing. What makes that sort of inherently or the problem or part of the problem, as opposed to, maybe being open to just making profit work for us instead of against us?
Well, I hope that it could be made. I mean, even within the current system, I think something could be done to make it work more for people, so to speak, than it is now. Obviously, I think so. Without, going to socialism, which is the ultimate. But so far we have seen that in every crisis, it has become more and more capital. The solutions have become more and more capital friendly. The markets have not been hurt at all. It has been, we've gone after the financial crisis, we have seen more stagnating wages for the lower end of the spectrum. It has not become more social. We have seen in many countries cuts in social services, all these types of things. So in that sense, it has not been geared more towards people. Could it be done? So I would say, in a way, I was thinking the other day that after the war in Denmark, we had a money exchange, because during the war, the Germans just printed money in the Danish central bank. Denmark was occupied by the Germans, and they bought things from Danish farmers. Danish farmers flourished, and so on and so forth, and all types of people who dealt with the Germans earned lots of money. And much of that was illegal. In order to get rid of that, there was a money exchange after the war. So a lot of that money was taken away again. In a way, there should be a movement to deleverage that whole superstructure of money. And that should be through the usual way. A simple way is higher interest rates. If the markets don't do it, try to do it, because this is really hurting a lot of businesses. On the other hand, a lot of them will also be hurt by higher interest rates. Bottom line is that everything you can propose to do politically is bound to be having a double edge. It will hurt some that you don't want to hurt. And that's also why I think the political system is very sort of stuck in many ways, because you can't really do that. Then those people will complain. And if you do that, those people will complain. But in the wake of, the green transformation, you will have to make sure that try to get rid of a lot of this money that is just in search of money. And I will think more about that. I'm, for example, very much in disagreement with the modern monetary theory, which just want to splurge all over the place, because that will get into the financial system. That will generate more of the same that we've seen, which we should not have more of. So I'm writing a lot about that here in Denmark, in order to get people that I otherwise agree with politically to see that this is not the right way.
Yeah, so, and I noticed in the paper that you said that if governments did that, if they just spent all this money, then maybe interest rates would have to go up. But an interesting thing about modern monetary theory is that they want to force interest rates to stay at zero at the same time all of this is happening. And that feels like it's just going to overstimulate the financial sector. So I wanted to...
Exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to get to another question. So my understanding is that one of the kind of inherent contradictions in capitalism that Marx points out is that capitalists always want to pay workers less money, but that when people have less money, they can't buy as many of the capitalists' products. So the capitalists kind of end up suffering too as a consequence of that. So my question to you is what would Marx have to say about the idea of make work? So the idea of creating jobs that exist for the benefit of the worker, not just for the product of the labor, but to give people money to ensure that people have enough income to buy stuff.
That was certainly a thought that was far away from his mind, I would say. He never mentioned this thought. and he would think it would be completely unrealistic. Of course, Marx lived before the welfare state. He did live during a period where wages started going up. And here you have to see the double process again, namely that with the increased productivity through development of machinery and so on and so forth, much could be produced with less labor time. And therefore, even if, let's make a numerical example, if half of the working day of 8 hours, 4 hours, was spent on reproducing the labor power, and half of the day went to the capitalist. This is very simplistic, but it's good to have the principles down. So if within that 4 hours, a certain amount of value was produced, which could be translated into consumer goods for the worker. If the consumer goods industries also were more productive, then the 4 hours that this guy spent would result in more consumer goods. So in that sense, everybody could be happy. And that's also what has happened. So in a way, when you look at the rate of exploitation, which is surplus value compared to the value of labor power, it has gone up. But of course, workers in our societies have had access to many more consumer goods than before. So he part of that is ascribed to productivity increases, and part of that, of course, is advantageous in many ways because there has been a win-win effect about it. Although in recent years we have seen that this has not been the case. And then, of course, nowadays we have complications about housing markets and all of that. I don't want to get involved in that because that's a whole that's making it much more complicated. But altogether, I would say that in recent years, most low-paid workers have not had better real wages.
Yeah, well, so
general agreement on that. So
yeah,
so
and so
in certain upswings, right after the Second World War, there was a huge upswing in what labor power got, and then there's been stagnation and so on.
So regardless of what Marx would have thought about it, I'm curious what you think about Alex's proposal, because it seems to tick off a lot of these boxes here in resolving this contradiction. So if you have the government put in a basic income and fund consumers, then we're allowing interest rates to get tightened. So we're squeezing the private financial sector. So maybe there's a little bit of suffering for firms there in which they have less of a free lunch. They have to get disciplined a little bit more. But meanwhile, the people who are benefiting is the people, every person, everyone who's buying goods and services from the economy. That's what you're trading out that stuff for. Of course, what you're doing there is it doesn't help the problem of workers with low wages. It doesn't really address that problem at all, but it does address the problem of people not having incomes to buy what all the work is producing.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, at a very basic level, I would put it together with the phenomenon called reproduction of labor power. I mean, in capitalist society, labor power has to be reproduced. That's through salaries, wages, but they do not just cover daily work, but also education and so on and so forth. And that part of it, which is education, health, and so on and so forth, can be then sort of going to the government so that the government funds it and takes care of that. And in our societies, we have also transfer incomes, namely social benefits for people who do not earn anything, which you can say somehow in general surplus value or whatever has to cover this. And you can rationalize it in many ways. So you can say, well, instead of having this little benefit, I mean, I noticed in the US you have millions of systems. I mean, the US is Byzantine. So of course you can rationalize these things and say, okay, instead of having this health benefit for this medicine and not for that, you can sort of say, okay, we give you $20 for this type of thing. So there's a certain amount of rationalization that's possible, but there's also huge resistance, and that resistance is to be taken seriously in an analysis. And that resistance is simply that it is a burden I mean, that's then people who are working will demand more salaries and so on and so forth. And the basic tendency is to cut down on all of that. So I see that resistance as being dominating at this time. I know there are people who work towards it, and now you have a more benevolent government in the US at least. But I doubt that this will happen anytime soon. There are pockets where they try it. I came across a Chinese example. Of course, China is a difficult type of, what should I say, capitalist society. But it is a capitalist society, I would say, basically, although there's a lot more government involvement than in other societies. But they want to give to poor people, or maybe older people, and so on, a certain amount of money per month, and do that through a digital currency, because they don't want it to go through the financial market, so that with that currency you can only buy this and that, but it will escape the financial markets, and that's quite interesting. But then on the other hand, I came to think, isn't that what you have in the US with food stamps? Isn't that just this? So yeah, it's a way of saying we want to try to spread this out, and so that people suffer a bit less and so on and so on. But I do not believe that it will substantially change a lot. I think these changes will have to come through workers actually opposing their conditions and then trying to get everybody on board. It's not something that will come through politics where you will get politicians who are nice and friendly and liberal to vote this through. Or if it's voted through, the basic benefits will be so low that they're not really helping anything and making it worse, because then people who really need support will get less, and the others will not get. The others who already have something do not need it to the same extent. So, I'm just all wavering. Of course, you have the system now in the crisis where you're paying checks to people, but nobody believes that this will be maintained forever.
Some people hope for that.
So that's sort of a complicated answer to a complicated question. I've thought a lot about it, but I'm sort of wavering.
So my understanding is that Marx sort of likes to divide society into people who produce more than they consume and people who consume more than they produce. And in his view, the people who consume more than they produce were generally kind of the capitalists who were exploiting the productive workers. So in his view, is someone who's like a welfare transfer payment recipient, is that someone who's exploiting workers? And then kind of a second question to add on to that is, in our economy, there are some people perhaps who want to produce more than they consume because they love to accumulate money. So they just keep accumulating the money and not spending all of it. So if some people produce more than they consume because they want to keep getting richer and richer, is it then okay that there are other people who consume more than they produce?
I mean, this is not how Marx looks at it. He doesn't think in terms of that. Capitalists don't produce anything. They just live off production. So that's point number one. And they don't normally, of course, consume their whole surplus value or profit. I mean, profits are shared through taxes, through rent, and so on and so forth, through interest with other sectors of the capitalist stratum. And even taxes he places as something that's paid out of surplus profit, surplus value. But when we look at then the narrow profit, which is what the firm actually retains for itself, the firms retain for themselves, of course, they go to wages for the whole upper stratum of that firm, those that do not produce actively. And here's a distinction between productive and unproductive workers that is very, very difficult, but that on the other hand is necessary, but I don't want to discuss it right now because it's too complicated here. But so when you look at it, would it be, it would be something that in the end would have to be out of what is produced without those people actively producing. But you could also say that they are part of the same class because they're potentially workers. So in that sense, they're part of the total reproduction of the working classes, like people who are unemployed, like people who are precarious workers, and so on, who are part of the working classes, although they're not actively working. And of course, there are many ways that people keep alive nowadays, and so on and so forth. But we have to we discuss the basics. So no, I mean, this is a good microeconomic fiction. This thing about everybody producing and sort of capital as such producing and getting a remuneration. But people are not equal to begin with, and they have to go into different conditions. So, but where is one belonging, like an office worker? Is that a working class, or are they living off profits in an indirect way? Whatever. That it's difficult to draw that line, but so yeah, that was my answer to the question. I think there was a sub question which I've forgotten in it that I should answer, but you can maybe remind me if there was one I haven't answered.
I think you basically answered it. So the two parts of the question was, are welfare recipients exploiting laborers? But you kind of said no, they're not, because they're really in that class and they're kind of potential workers who are not working right now. And then the other part of the question was, if someone's just producing a lot and selling it and accumulating money and producing more than they consume because they want to, is that person really being exploited, or is it fine because they're happy getting rich? And you said that Marx doesn't really think about it that way.
No, not at all. Because he basically thinks they just organize production. They don't produce value as such. So this is another funny thing nowadays, that's what all the big bosses say. They produce value, right? So they assume that role for themselves, that they are value producing. But that's definitely, I call it the what do you call it? The revisionist theory of value. I mean, because they sort of revise it onto themselves. So many of these categories are being popularized, but in a perverted form. So that's also fun to make clear.
Yeah, it's actually very hard to draw these boundaries and decide who's productive, who's not, and who's more productive. Sometimes that's pretty obvious, but in a lot of times, maybe people are just kind of going through the motions of that. So one response to that is to try to more aggressively find really who are the real producers and allocate stuff to them. But I mean, another solution is to not worry so much about who's the producers and become more concerned about how productive the overall economy is, the whole system, and including not just people or categories of them, but also the machines, the resources, everything. And as far as people are concerned and what category we can put them into, we can just say, well, people are the beneficiaries of that, where ideally we would just like us to benefit from all of this production, whoever does it, and whatever projects, whatever portion of it they might be involved in, that we could just emphasize the fact that people are supposed to benefit from it.
Yeah, you can imagine many things, but I don't think it's the way the system works. And although this distinction that I'm putting up here, productive, unproductive, is something that drives the profitability. Because if you somehow live off the profits produced, and you have more and more workers who do that, then you also have to have more and more profits produced in order for the system to maintain itself. So it's not just a question of what I like or what you like. I like the same things you do, obviously, but I mean, I'm just trying to see how is it really deep down operating, and to see signs that this is indeed the case, what I'm saying. I think when we want to analyze all of that, we have to take the rest of the world into account and how the West benefits from its relationships with the rest of the world. I think that's very important. We haven't discussed that. So in a way, we can live ever so happily up here, and we have so many people really produce nothing of value in neither social useful terms or in capitalist terms, but we somehow survive very well because we have a good place in the world. And now I would like to come back to Merling, because he sort of sees the layers of societies in terms of the financial system, but that's also a phenomenon which goes through in terms of what we get from the system. What he posits is that there are the rich countries, and especially the US on the top, that sort of can can manipulate the money system a lot, but there are others underneath that will have to control themselves much more. The second layer, and then the third layer of the very poor countries who have no monetary leeway whatsoever and have to wait for every dollar they can earn in the international markets and can barely get finance or finance on very harsh terms. So in that way, we can also get their products much more cheaply. So we benefit from that. So I think I would also like him maybe to come into that discussion. What is that going on? And I noticed that the other day in a symposium, there were people who were sort of juggling with these thoughts. And it would be good to have that developed further.
Okay, we're reaching the end here. So I just want to ask you one final question, Karen, and then you can also give your final thoughts. What would Marx have said, or did he say, about the idea of basic income or something like a universal basic income?
Well, I think I basically said what he would say, but you may say, I mean, has it any monetary, I mean, has it to do with money system? I would say, no, it has to do with transfers of income in real terms. I mean, I give you goods or access to goods that I don't consume myself. So it's not a monetary phenomenon. He would say maybe what I've said already, that you can see it as part of the reproduction of society, of the working class, through the intermediation of this government that did not play at all that role in Marxist days. So that you can easily elaborate on his thought, whether he would think that it would be possible in this situation or that, or how much basic income would be in any case. I can't help thinking of the UK, which has something now called universal credit. And what is universal credit is 6 separate benefits that are put together into one, and then they lowered the whole thing. So you risk many things when you have good ideas, and if they look like they become realized, because they can easily be thwarted. And I also can mention that I heard a Brazilian economist, Helena Lavinas, who has done a study of like basic income in developing countries, where they are starting giving money transfers to poor people, which is completely new. And what happened was that they immediately indebted themselves. Many of them did. So in the end, they ended up as debt slaves, because the little income they had, because it was steady income stream, got capitalized in some way, so they could borrow against that. And then in the end, they would have a huge debt. So they were worse off really than before. So, I mean, you have to be careful what you wish for. That's all I'm saying. I think that's a good old saying.
All right. Well, those are some good words of caution there. So thanks for joining us, Karen. This is a very interesting discussion. And next week's topic, we have a fellow by the name of Chris Rimmer joining us to discuss a framework he's developed for making sense of the economy by describing it in terms of everybody's net worth. Where does basic income fit into that, or does it? So see people next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.